So Mark Carney has led the Liberal Party in Canada to a victory of sorts. He will now, it looks like, form a minority government in Canada. They are the biggest party and they should have enough friends, in inverted commas, amongst other parties to be able to rule in Canada. So this is a big surprise if we look back from 3 or 4 months ago when Justin Trudeau, then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, in French I guess, he was very, very unpopular and he then resigned. Mark Carney took over. He's actually also a British and an Irish citizen in addition to Canadian, have been the former governor of the Bank of England, and he took over, became Prime Minister, and then now is actually elected to the Parliament and will form the biggest party and continue on as Prime Minister of Canada. And the backdrop of this has been Donald Trump's unprecedented, what seemed like trolling or joking in the beginning about making Canada the 51st state of the United States of America. However, in his first 100 days as president for the second time in the United States, he has continued to insist that that's what's going to happen, in addition to making similar kind of threats to Greenland, which is part of Denmark, and to Panama about the Panama Canal. So this rhetoric from the US is believed to have played a huge role in Mark Carney's victory. It seemed very unlikely that the leader of the Liberal Party could actually emerge as the biggest party in the Canadian Parliament 3 or 4 months ago, before Donald Trump's inauguration for a second time in the US. And the leader of the Conservatives had used similar rhetoric to Donald Trump in the sense of his campaigning with Canada First as a slogan, and that has seemingly backfired on him. He did not even win his seat in the Canadian Parliament. It's pretty crazy. His name is Pierre Poilievre, and the big question for me on this channel, is this good or is this bad for Ukraine? Привет again, my name is Connor Klein. Welcome to Connor Klein Geopolitics. I have a better known lifestyle channel, but I've created this channel to use my background in international relations and also my legal background to give you a more nuanced and informed perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I'm obviously here in Lviv. We've got the University of Lviv behind me, so I'm here on the ground. And from Ukraine's perspective, Mark Carney versus Pierre Poilievre, both of them would have been pretty supportive of Ukraine, no matter who had won. However, Mark Carney is more into multilateralism. He hasn't been seen to be echoing any of Donald Trump's rhetoric. Donald Trump, since he became president, has not had a pro-Ukrainian foreign policy, unlike his predecessor Joe Biden. And Joe Biden's was not unquestioning support whatsoever. In hindsight, it seems that the Biden administration has plotted basically to create this impasse that we see on the battlefield in the Russo-Ukrainian war. The Biden administration did not back Ukraine to victory in late 2022, early 2023, just before the Ukrainian offensive in the south to try and reclaim that territory that is being occupied by Russia illegally, with enough materiel or financial support that would arrive in time to allow them to do that. So Donald Trump has reversed that policy. He has not requested any new aid. He is allowing the aid that had been appropriated during the Biden administration's term in office to be delivered to Ukraine, and the intel and other support. However, he did cut it off momentarily for Ukraine just at the same time as Russia launched a counteroffensive in the Kursk Oblast, which is a small part of Russia that is occupied by Ukraine currently. Still a tiny, tiny bit of that is occupied by Ukraine. However, his policy of cutting off the support, even though it was short term, has had huge effects on Ukraine's capacity. It demonstrated that the US is now a very reliable ally, since they're willing to do that and just cut it off. And also this has reverberations for the US's other allies. And this is actually an important point about Mark Carney winning, because he's more in favor of multilateralism than Poilievre would have been, based on what they said before the elections. And Donald Trump is clearly not in favor of that. He has not been particularly close to the US's traditional allies, like the United Kingdom and their European allies. And we just have to look at the tariff debacle that has played out over the last month to see an example of that. So whilst Carney is even more in favor of supporting Ukraine than Poilievre, it isn't a massive difference at the end of the day between the two of them. Both of them would have been broadly supportive of continuing Canadian aid to Ukraine, which is not a huge amount in the first place. Most of the material and financial support for Ukraine that comes from outside from its allies comes from its European partners, and to a declining extent from the United States and not from Canada. However, I think if we look at this as a trend, Ukraine really needs its allies to step up, particularly in Europe, as the US takes a step back at the very least. And the fact that a politician, Poilievre, failed so disastrously as a result of being seen as too close to Donald Trump and Donald Trump's rhetoric, which is not in line with respecting the sovereignty of other countries and their borders. His rhetoric so far, he obviously hasn't invaded Greenland or Canada or tried to change those borders with through military coercion as yet. However, his rhetoric tends to mirror that a lot of Russia and some of their justifications for their imperial war of aggression against Ukraine. The war here is basically because Russia doesn't accept that Ukraine has a right to be independent of Moscow, and Ukrainians want to be independent of Moscow because they don't see it as a particularly attractive offer to stay in Russia's sphere of influence, especially economically, when they look how well countries like Poland and the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, have done in the last 30 years or so, since they've been free of Moscow's control. So the broader trend is that being seen as close to Donald Trump or having Donald Trump's support or just Donald Trump's rhetoric towards your country and his belief that we are now in some sort of multipolar world, it seems, and that imperialism is back. At least that's what his rhetoric has been suggesting. And also his proposed peace plan for Ukraine would have seen the US recognizing illegally seized Ukrainian territory by Russia, namely Crimea at the very least. This means that looking forward at other elections in key states that are supporting Ukraine, it is more likely than not that candidates that are strong on supporting Ukraine and distance themselves from Donald Trump are more likely to do well than candidates that do the opposite, because there's such a dramatic turnaround by the Liberal Party as a result of Donald Trump's aggressive rhetoric towards Canada, and Poilievre previously having tried to associate himself in terms of the messaging and the slogans with Donald Trump. That has proved so disastrous for the Conservatives. Remember, the Liberal Party was unpopular for a reason. It was nothing to do with Ukraine or the US, and those reasons for their unpopularity still remain. However, Canadians, when faced with a choice, went for the Liberals over the Conservatives as a result of Donald Trump. It seems to me that's the understanding that most people are working on for the sudden reversal. So I think as a trend going forward, that is very good for Ukraine. If we look at what are going to be a key election, I think, in Hungary within the next 2 years, there has to be new elections in Hungary for the parliament, and Viktor Orban has been the most vocal pro-Russian politician in Europe, we'll say, or definitely in the European Union, or what should be an ally of Ukraine. Obviously, we have Robert Fico in Slovakia. His election will presumably be after that of Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban was actually in Hungary when he was re-elected as Prime Minister in 2022, so it was quite early. Would have been probably around April or 2022 or maybe May. So term is normally 5 years, if I remember, in Hungary. So he's got to have an election before that is up, and he is increasingly less popular. So I guess we could say unpopular in Hungary. Doesn't mean that he wouldn't win another term. However, he's not in a strong position as he was 4 or 5 years ago. And if this is also a trend that is reflected in a country like Hungary, since Donald Trump is a big fan of his, and Orban's rhetoric and foreign policy has orientated more towards supporting being on good terms with Russia than being on good terms with Ukraine, then that would be a particularly good sign for Ukraine that politicians like Viktor Orban may actually lose upcoming elections in favor of candidates that are more pro-Ukrainian. So I think that's the main thing to take out of this election in Canada from a Ukrainian point of view that is positive is actually the general trend. If we look at the reasons for which the Liberals were successful all of a sudden in Canada, and not actually really the difference between the Conservatives and the Liberals in Canada, since their policies were not hugely different, and Canada does not actually provide that much aid to Ukraine that's going to be a game changer or anything like that. So I'll leave the video with those final thoughts. Drop your comments down below in the comment section to this video, not in the description. In the description, you can go, if you were coming here to Ukraine, then I actually have a guide for traveling to Ukraine during this war. Not only does it have the logistical information and advice about how to stay as safe as possible. We had some alerts earlier today. Fortunately for me, since I've been in Lviv, it's been over 10 days now. We haven't had any significant Russian terror attacks in the cities or anything else happen untoward. However, that can change in the blink of an eye in an instant, and you want to be prepared if you come here to Ukraine. Also have my hospitality guide that I have been updating, at least the Lviv section, in the last week or so. So the best cafes, bars, restaurants, shisha lounges, etc. There isn't that much clubbing going on in Ukraine, but I guess there is still a little bit of that. I have all that in the guides that's down below in the description, and I will see you in the next video. Do побачення, and as is written on my t-shirt, Slava Ukraini.